I have the pleasure of introducing somebody that you probably know very well, Dr. Chicoine, and I hope everyone's had a great session so far, and I think you will enjoy this one. So without further ado, Dr. Chicoine.
Thank you, Allie. Can everybody hear me okay? I heard in the beginning, the first one, maybe not. My children would find it amazing that people tell me this, but sometimes people tell me I speak too softly. So if that's happening, please just raise your hand or throw something or whatever. So everything we've learned today, or everything we've talked about today, a lot of it is built on the experience of serving 6,000 people. Some of it certainly comes from other people's research. But the other component is that we really like to go forward is do some more research at our place, and that's what we're going to talk about here this afternoon. So why research? Here is the short answer. So it really is about people with Down syndrome and their families, but also for not only the professionals that serve in our clinic, but other places, that we really want the care that's delivered to be the best care that it possibly can be. We want it based on science and evidence as well as compassion, and that's really what research is all about. So many years ago, when the clinic opened, someone asked me, a family member asked me, and not my family member, but a family member of a patient asked me, "Do you do research?" And I said, no, we don't. We didn't at that time. And they said, good, because we've gone other places, and all they wanted to do was research, and they had no interest in actually providing health care. So they would do an 8-hour assessment, gave a lot of recommendations, and then send us on our way with nowhere to get any care at all. And so at that time, that apparently was a good thing. But then as it became clear that there were a lot of unanswered questions, and we're going to talk about that in just a second. But so really then the question became, are research and clinical practice compatible? So our early research efforts or education efforts were our books, but we're now looking at doing things more formally as well and publishing in what are called referee journals, where other researchers will look at that and sort of approve the writing, if you will, and then get it published in the journals. So our sense is it's not only compatible, but it really is essential. And we really want to understand better everything that we do and make sure that we're doing things that are meaningful. And this really came to roost recently. Excuse me. All of you should drink water. As I drink my soda, I apologize. So it really came to light. I knew this already, but it really came to light recently. So we're working on healthcare guidelines, and the history of that is a group of us, and I'm part of the Down. I'm actually on the board. Katie and I are both on the board of the Down Syndrome Medical Interest Group USA. And years ago, 20-some years ago, a group of us sat around a table at a meeting, and we sort of made up guidelines. So at that point, it was best evidence, what people's experience was, and there was very little data to support that. Support what we're doing, but a lot of people had seen a lot of individuals with Down syndrome. We took the best shot at the healthcare guidelines for adults and kids at that time. And then over the course of the years, the American Academy of Pediatrics took over the pediatric portion of the guidelines, and then so the adult portion has kind of languished for 20-some years, so sort of without a real update. And recently, the Global Down Syndrome Foundation, which is out of Denver, raised some funds and hired ECRI, which is ECRI Institute, which is a firm that assists a variety of organizations develop healthcare guidelines for whatever the topic is. So it might be arthritis, it might be seizures, or whatever the case may be, and so they're helping us with the adult guidelines. So a number of members of the Down Syndrome Medical Interest Group and some others came together and have been working on this for many months. And we had a meeting in Denver a few months ago. The thing that became really clear is that there really is a lot of gaps in the information that we really would, to make the best guidelines possible, there's a lot of gaps in that. In fact, one of ECRI's requirements was that there had to be at least 300 subjects in a study to basically include the study in the guidelines. And for one of the topics I was particularly responsible for was atherosclerosis, which is heart disease, a buildup of plaque that causes heart attacks. There was really only one study that fit the criteria, and it was out of the UK. So there really was no study in the United States that really fit the criteria. Now, we went back and then looked at our own data at the clinic, and we had data from 2,860 individuals, so which was a substantial number. Now, they had about 6,000 in the UK, but we had almost 3,000, which was also a substantial number. And our data actually was a little different, or not a little, it was significantly different than one that's published. And so they found that the incidence of atherosclerotic disease was about 80% as common in people with Down syndrome as it is in others. And in our data, out of 2,860 over the course of 27 years, we have one heart attack and 5 other people that have heart disease, atherosclerotic disease. So we find that it's very uncommon. So that's just one example of gaps in the information that going forward that we really need to sort through. So, again, that's just one instance. But the guidelines are moving along, and we're going to certainly have, I think, a good start. But this is going to be an ongoing process. And one of the responsibilities of each of the groups that's working on the specific topics is at the end of the guideline recommendation is to make recommendations for additional research that needs to be done. And I can tell you that's a lengthy section for each guideline. So as we look at research, it really is when or where is the effect, and it's today, tomorrow, and then somewhere in between. So a lot of the tomorrows. So I'll start with today. So this is years ago, pre-computers. We would hand out a health promotion notebook that we would give to each individual that came to the clinic. And again, that was based on the knowledge we had at the time. And again, we talked earlier about how we're going to try to get that online and as we go forward. And so that's some of the things we learned we can put together pretty quickly and then share pretty rapidly. So I went online. And so, for example, for a drug, to develop a new drug, this is the FDA process. And this is just sort of a schematic of the FDA process to develop a new drug. You can imagine each of those steps is hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars, and so that part is going to be significantly more challenging. So that's tomorrow. But I think those are also important things because there are certainly going to be some breakthroughs that we certainly are going to look for. So the Food and Drug Administration really has a complicated process, but those are some things we are also trying to start to get involved in. So we're going to be looking, I think some of the keys will be looking at medications that are already used for people that don't have Down syndrome and what are the benefits in people with Down syndrome, and also medications that may be truly unique medications that are not available to anyone at this point, and what might be the effect on people with Down syndrome. So there's a number of topics that we're beginning to look at and really become interested in. So some of you may not be familiar with this, some may. There's what we're calling adult regression syndrome because there really is not a formalized name yet. So this is something that occurs typically in people between about age 15 and 25. It's not real common, but enough of it that it's a problem, and it's a significant loss of skills. It's not autism. That happens in younger kids, and it's not Alzheimer's disease. That happens in older adults, some older adults. But there are some folks that do decline roughly between age 15 and 25. And so that's something we've become real interested in because there just really is not a lot of information about that out there, unfortunately. So again, I actually took the lead in the Down Syndrome Medical Interest Group work group. We're looking at the regression. Dr. Capone from Johns Hopkins and I recently published a chapter on this. And then for those of you that want to learn more about it, LuMind, which we're going to talk more about in a second. LuMind is an organization that helps fund and organize research, has a series of webinars. And Dr. Capone and I did a webinar recently on regression. So if that's something you'd like to learn more about. But I think this is one of the important topics, and ultimately LuMind is going to be interested in researching this as well. So and again, I'll come back to that in a second. And then there is a database that some folks at Harvard and other sites have been gathering to start to pull together some of the cases for young people that have this regression syndrome, so we can begin to get an idea of what this looks like, how you would define it, and ultimately how you would treat it. So that's just one example of something that we're beginning to look at. We're not part of that database yet. We're working to get there. But one of the examples of things we're beginning to look at to see if we can improve the health of some of our folks that have developed additional health issues. And one of our other issues is, what does this have to do with research? So one of our other things is that, we've talked about today is how do we get information into the hands of the individuals with Down syndrome themselves? So you probably all played this game as a child. What is the difference? The bee on the left has NMM on his, around his, I guess bees have waist, whatever. NMM, the other one has FVA and whatnot. You can see, you see the difference. You probably all played this as a child. So when we played this game as a kid, we would go one step further, and we'd always ask, what happened between picture 1 and picture 2? What might have occurred? So we're going to play that game right now, if you allow me the opportunity here. So what do you see there? This is one of our exam rooms. What do you see there? See an exam table? What do you see on the table? A gown and papers. So the papers are patient education materials that are all going to make you all healthy, that you're going to look at very thoroughly and when you get home. Okay? So here's the next picture. What do you see there? So the gown is there and the papers are gone. So what would you play the game like we did when we were kids? What happened here? You did an exam? Well, you're rushing ahead here. What happened to those papers? They took them home and they are reading them. In fact, they're still sitting in the parking lot reading them thoroughly before they left. But what do you see after they're gone out of the waiting room? So that is metaphorically the problem with patient education. So studies done in people without Down syndrome, most people walk out and have forgot 50% of what the doctor said before they walk out the door. And of the 50% that they remember, about 50% or more they remember incorrectly. So we're down to about 25% of useful information. Why does that happen? Years ago, I was playing basketball, I tore my anterior cruciate ligament, went to the orthopedic surgeon. He says, first words out of his mouth, you're going to need surgery. He then explained 20 minutes what was going to happen. Very beautiful explanation. Unfortunately, my mind is going, who's going to get kids to school? This was pre-computer. Who's going to carry the charts around the office when I'm trying to see patients? How am I going to get this? How am I going to do that? Where am I going to find the time to do physical therapy? And he got to the end of the explanation and said, do you have any questions? And really my question was, could you start over? But I knew he wouldn't do that anyway. So I said, oh, absolutely not. You explained it beautifully. I understand everything. And obviously I understood nothing. So I had to go home and look it up. So that's just one example. So we're thinking something else. Certainly, if it's too hot in the exam room, it's too cold in the exam room, you're running late. Of course, I never run late, so I don't know how that could possibly be. Whatever the case may be. So we tend to forget what we learn in the doctor's office. If that's true for people without an intellectual disability, how much more is it likely to be for someone with an intellectual disability? So, traditionally we've typically given out the handout, and we don't remember it. I don't think our patients remember most of it. Many of them leave them behind sitting on the chair. And we don't retain much. And again, we retain much of what we retain incorrectly. And again, we think that's probably more of an issue for people with Down syndrome than it is with others. So one of the things that we got really interested in, as we talked about this morning, was how can we improve that? How can we prove that? So again, we talked about self-modeling and peer modeling as being something that we thought would be benefit. Now, this has been shown in the other, the school educational world, but it's never been demonstrated before in the patient education world. And so we really did our first video study. We looked at immediate learning. So people they came in, and it's a hand washing study. Hand washing is so, hand washing is the number one. I mean, it sounds silly, but it's the number one thing left and right, as far as preventing illness. There's signs all over the hospital and whatnot. What are the 10 leading causes of disease? And, it's 2 hands with the 10 fingers. So hand washing is a huge issue. And I think that, certainly most of us, don't do it adequately. And certainly I don't think that our patients probably do it, that much greater than the rest of us. So, so an important topic. So we used hand washing, also very measurable. So we used hand washing as our skill, if you will. And so the first study demonstrated the person would come in, they would they would wash their hands, we would videotape that, and then we would show them a video. And in the first study, there were sort of different things that they would watch depending on the individual, what group they got selected in. But the long and short of it, there was one of the things one of the groups watched was a video of one of our patients washing his hands correctly. And we found that the video of the patient washing his hands correctly was a viable, effective teaching method towards teaching people how to wash their hands. Now, it ended up being, it was a small study, so statistically there may not have been enough subjects, if you will, to demonstrate a difference between watching the person with Down syndrome wash their hands and watching the person without Down syndrome washing her hands. But it really didn't sort of matter to us because we demonstrated, even on a small study, that watching another person with Down syndrome wash their hands was an effective tool. And I think from a inclusion standpoint, we want people with Down syndrome to be participating in the healthcare process. So as long as we demonstrated that, the rest really, in our mind, didn't matter. And so that study's been submitted for publication, and hopefully that'll be published in the near future. And we wanted to take it. That was just immediate learning. So we wanted to take it another step further, and this project's going on right now. And so the second one was the person comes in, they wash their hands, they watch the video, and so now it's all watching the video of a person with Down syndrome. So the person's kind of competing against themselves, if you will. We're going to see how they improve. So the person comes in, they wash their hands, we take a video of them, or they watch the video, they wash their hands again. Now someone donated 40 tablets. We send them home with a tablet with the video on it, and in theory they should watch that every day. And then they come back in a month, and we have them measure it again, and then we take that tablet away, and we ask them to come back in a month later. So it's immediate learning. It's what's the learning from repetitive viewing, and then what's the retention after a month after not having the video. And early data, but it's looking promising. So I think we get enough subjects. I think we'll again probably demonstrate what we're hoping to demonstrate. And I think that it's a real important thing that we go back to. It's not if people with Down syndrome can participate in their own health care, it's how. How can we help that happen? And we want to really demonstrate that there are effective tools. So I would give a plug that this study's ongoing, and if you're interested, I would encourage you to sign up. We're hoping to get about 30 more people. So I encourage you if you'd like to sign up for that. And there is some information at one of the tables out where the tables were earlier. Another real interesting thing that I find very interesting, and I say this comes partly, again, I'm one of 7 children, and I always say that waste was not an option growing up. And so I thought that's sort of built into me, and so that's the way I approach medicine as well. I don't like to do things that don't have purpose and meaning. I don't need to spend your money doing things that are not going to benefit. And actually may harm you. So this is something I became very interested in. So we know that solid tumors are less common in people with Down syndrome. Breast cancer, brain cancer, colon cancer, things like that. We know they're less common. So several years ago, we had a study published on mammograms where we went back and looked. It was about not quite 1,000 mammograms that we looked at, and there was very little breast cancer in our practice. In fact, there were only 2 cases. One was what's essentially considered sort of a quasi-benign malignant tumor, and the other one was a very unaggressive type of malignancy. Both women got partial treatment based on family and patient decision, and neither ended up dying of the complications of their breast cancer. They died of something else. So the mammogram in women with Down syndrome, the utility of it is in question, basically. What is the benefit? It does seem to be significantly less benefit than in women without Down syndrome. as we finish this up, just through a very series of interesting events, we got linked up, myself and this guy from Denver got linked up with some engineers from the University of Wisconsin in Madison and a couple other sites. And they've developed a computer model for health screening, for mammography screening. And it was their data was used in the non-Down syndrome population when the United States Service Preventative Task Force recently changed the recommendations from recommending every year starting at age 40 to every other year starting at age 50. And so they used, looked at the incidence in women with Down syndrome compared to the others, and they found that it takes literally thousands of mammograms on their computer model to find a cancer and potentially save a life. And it also took hundreds of biopsies that were benign to find one that was malignant. So the downside to that is we know this is a population that has more potential risk in the OR with anesthesia than other folks. And so there is a potential there that we're actually potentially going to do more harm than good with doing mammograms in women with Down syndrome. Now, that's not been decided yet. How's the role of family history play into that? We don't really know. I think there's a lot we don't know yet. But I think as this article hopefully will get, and this also has been submitted and hopefully will get published soon, as that gets published, I think that's one of the pieces of evidence we're going to take to the next round of the healthcare guidelines and say how does this get fit into the picture. So I think it's helpful information to share and say, this is one extra piece that we want to look at, and does that make sense for you to do a mammogram? And I think it's, I'm not saying don't do them at this point, but I just say I think this is going to be something we're going to end up weighing into the decision. And again, how does family history play into that? We don't really know at this point, and so that's sort of an unknown. But again, so the second study was actually submitted to one journal, and it got typically when you submit, there's typically two or three, mostly three. Reviewers, and got 3 glowing reports from the 3 reviewers. But the editor said, I don't want to be in a position of suggesting rationing care to women with Down syndrome. And so therefore the article was rejected. And my response to that was, we're not looking to ration care. We are looking to provide rational care. And what I mean by that is we really want to make sure we're doing things that make sense. So if there are things that are less common, and actually screening for them might actually cause more harm than good, that's probably not something we should do. On the other hand, there are conditions in people with Down syndrome that are more common, and those we probably want to be screening more aggressively than you would in somebody else. And so that's certainly panning out with the healthcare guidelines with things like thyroid and celiac and whatnot, where those things are more common, and we're going to look at those differently than you would in the rest of the population. So again, don't go home and say that Dr. Chacoin said don't do mammograms yet. We're not there yet. But I think this is 2 pieces of very interesting information that going forward I think are going to make a lot of sense with regards to trying to provide rational care. And just as a caution, and again I think the editor's misguided perception, this is not an economic issue, partly. I mean, it's mostly not an economic issue. I mean, it's probably a little bit of an economic issue. But I think mostly this is, we don't want to do things that actually, you could screen men. Men do get breast cancer. But why don't we screen men for breast cancer? First off, because it's so uncommon, it's just not worth screening millions of men to find very few breast cancers. Very costly. But then there's going to be every test is going to have some abnormalities. And then it's not so much the test itself, but what are the follow-up things? In the case of breast cancer, it's biopsies and anesthesia that may be taken. So these are things that we're going to have to continue to look at as we go forward. We want to make sure that we're really studying this stuff so that we're providing the care that makes sense. Now, ultimately, I think there will be financial issues. And ultimately, as we sort of go more towards full risk care, which means your insurance says, here's $100, your doctor gets $100 this month to provide you health care. And if we're spending 95 of it on things that really have little or no benefit, we're not going to have the finances to spend the things that make sense. So, for example, I've started to have some discussion if our patients start going to full risk, things like mammograms and colonoscopies, if they end up not making sense, as we sort this out, so we're going to save a whole bunch of money by not doing that screening. How about then we put that money back into getting an audiologist in the office? because we know hearing tests or hearing loss is much more common, and it's one more step for families to go someplace else to get the hearing test. So that's kind of the way I would see rational care. We really want to go, what are the things that are more of a problem? We want to make sure we're attending to, and if things are so uncommon that screening for them is actually going to be more of a harm than a good, then we really probably don't want to be doing that. And so those are the things we've got to sort out over the next several years here. And I think will ultimately be built into the guidelines. Those it was actually probably worked out best. I was kind of pushing for the first round to have the cancer screening as part of the first round of healthcare guidelines, and it didn't get in there. But it's probably good because I think in the next round, over the next several years, we will have more information that will make those decisions much more meaningful. We'll shift gears. Certainly as individuals with Down syndrome have become more independent, some living on their own, living in a variety of settings, the question of sex education comes up pretty frequently. And there's a couple things that have been shown by other studies that are very interesting. One is that a person with an intellectual disability that has received sexual education is actually less likely to be abused, and if they are abused, they're actually better, they recover better. So there's two interesting points. So one of the things that, and I understand, is sometimes families, well, I don't want someone else to do this education because they're going to put values in that I don't share. And I think that's a legitimate question. So what Katie, Dr. Frank, is doing as part of her, her PhD thesis was on parents as the primary sex educators. And so she provides a curriculum to help teach parents how to teach their own sons and daughters about sexual education. And so she did that study as part of her thesis, and then she did another study since she's been with us. The first one was with, for young adults, and the more recent one was with young adults, and the previous one was with adolescents, 12 to 19. So she developed this curriculum and then goes through it with the parents. And generally what she found is the parents become much more comfortable with taking on that responsibility as for themselves. And I think the opportunity to and then put their own values into the equation that maybe they might not feel is getting done in a different setting. So I think that's been a real valuable tool, and both of those articles are being submitted hopefully for publication as well. So those things, again, are a little slower process, but some of that information we took and we made an appropriate touch video that's online, not necessarily clearly research-based from a sense, but took that information we learned and things that we saw that were helpful with regards to what might be helpful for people with Down syndrome as far as learning this information going forward, and it would help them. And again, I think even from the abuse standpoint, I think it's well worth looking at, because if the studies do show less abuse and better recovery from abuse, and I think that's I think those are worthwhile things in and of themselves. Another thing people have gotten real interested in the last several years is the issue of, is there a possibility that we can improve cognition in people with Down syndrome through medications? And so there's been a lot of interest in this, and Dr. Alberto Costa at the, where is he, in Cleveland? Case Western in Cleveland has actually developed a study with memantine. Memantine is a drug that is FDA approved for use in Alzheimer's disease. And he is using it actually in a much younger group to see if it improves cognition in the younger group. So this study is actually being done in Cleveland and in Brazil. We're not actually technically part of the study. I am a contracted hire, if you will, that I do a physical exam during there's 3 visits basically, and we save people one trip to Cleveland by doing a physical exam in the middle. So the first visit and the third visit are done in Cleveland. We do a physical exam here in Chicago, or in Park Ridge in the second visit, and saves them a trip to Cleveland. And we've actually had several people locally that have participated in this and have come to us for that middle physical. So it's a very interesting study. There is, and I'll show it bigger in a second, if you're interested in any study, there's a thing called clinicaltrials.gov. And I encourage you to take a look at that. If you have any interest, a nice search engine on that page where you can put in Down syndrome and look at all the studies going on really across the United States and other places as well. And I don't know if those of you that attended the sleep apnea is another interesting question. Some suggest that it may be as high as 85%. I'm not sure it's quite that high, but sleep apnea is a significant problem in people with Down syndrome. And a lot of interesting things going on with this. For those of you that might have attended the presentation on how to better use a CPAP, we had that earlier today. And then one of the tables was by a company called Inspire. And let me tell you a little bit about that. So first off is screening. So you probably know that the ways most of sleep apnea in people with Down syndrome is obstructive, meaning the airway closes as they breathe when they're sleeping, and then it causes them to not to move air, and then they have their oxygen goes down, and their sleep cycle is all disturbed, and it can cause significant problems. And it is significantly more common in people with Down syndrome. It has both mental and physical health implications. So to test it, you have to get a sleep study, which involves things on your face, on your scalp, and fingers and nose and other things. And you can imagine that there's a significant number of people that don't find that very pleasing. And so there's been some studies done to see are there other ways possibly to screen it. Now, this didn't pan out, but I think it's very interesting on the possibility going forward. So Brian Scotko at Harvard and others did a study a few years ago, and they were actually looking at different chemicals in the urine to see if you can actually screen for sleep apnea that way, which is a fascinating concept. It ended up not panning out. But I think going forward, there's going to be some interesting things going forward. My sense is that we probably ought to be screening everybody with Down syndrome every year or two, but everyone to get a sleep study every year or two probably doesn't make sense. I mean, not probably, doesn't make sense. So some easier method of screening for sleep apnea, I think, going forward is going to be important, whether it be urine or blood or whatever the case may be. I think that's going to be real interesting going forward. And then the other thing is Inspire has anyone that's tried to use a CPAP, a lot of people who don't have Down syndrome find using a CPAP very challenging. The CPAP is the mask that's used to help treat sleep apnea, which we're demonstrating right up there. And a lot of people who don't have Down syndrome find that very challenging to use, and you can imagine a lot of people with Down syndrome find that challenging to use as well. So there's now something called Inspire. It is a device that is surgically implanted. It's sort of like a pacemaker for breathing. And what it does is there's a pacemaker piece of it, and one lead attaches to the diaphragm. And so it kind of senses when you start to breathe. And the other lead actually attaches to the nerve that goes to the tongue. So as you start to breathe in, it pushes the tongue forward and opens the airway and then relaxes. And so it goes on all night long. And you turn it on with a magnet before you go to sleep. And so it is FDA approved in adults. It wasn't tested in adults with Down syndrome, but it was tested in adults. And so adults with Down syndrome sort of get grandfathered into that. But it's not FDA approved in children, and there's actually a study going on right now in children with Down syndrome. And so far, I've talked to the folks doing it, and they've had some. They don't have great numbers at this point as far as the number of people that have been involved, but there are. They have some promising experience with that so far. So I think that might be something interesting going forward as far as being able to treat sleep apnea in a different way. And this is a very large problem in people without Down syndrome as well. So I think that we will see more looking at this going forward, and hopefully better treatments as we go forward. So unfortunately, we have to talk about Alzheimer's disease. You probably know that there is an association between Alzheimer's disease and Down syndrome. Unfortunately, nearly all people with Down syndrome have the plaques and tangles that are associated with Alzheimer's by age of 40, and essentially all people with Down syndrome over the age of 60 have these plaques and tangles. And why is it more common in people with Down syndrome? Due to the extra chromosome, there are genes that are triplicated. So there are three of the chromosome 21, and each of those chromosomes has genes. And so sometimes you're going to have then three of those genes. And there's a gene called APP, or amyloid precursor protein, that is on chromosome 21. And there are some studies that find that there's compelling evidence that the increased gene dose, meaning having 3 of those genes instead of 2, for that APP and its products is related to Alzheimer's disease and Down syndrome. There are also other chromosome 21 genes may impact Alzheimer's disease and Down syndrome, as may genes on other chromosomes, including variants that also increase the probability of Alzheimer's disease, but a uniquely important role is thought to be played by the increased dose of APP. So clinically, it becomes a significant concern for people with Down syndrome. Now, I should make it clear that not everybody with Down syndrome gets Alzheimer's disease. We know that. But the risk is greater, and it's also younger. And so it is a significant problem. So again, kind of going back, when I applied for medical school, I specifically avoided medical schools that had a research requirement. When I applied for residency, I specifically avoided residencies that had a research requirement. That was not my thing. I was going to be a family physician. I practiced in a small town. I came back and had this wonderful opportunity to participate in the Down syndrome clinic, but I was not a researcher. It became clear, particularly around this, on a lot of subjects, but particularly around this one, we have seen more people with Down syndrome than anybody else in the United States. And it became clear that not only did we have a responsibility, that we had an opportunity to participate in this. And so we really felt very strongly that we should get involved in whatever way that we could. Now, fortunately, along came LuMind. LuMind is, I mentioned before, LuMind, and actually they just merged with the International Down Syndrome Coalition or something or other, I forget what the name is. So now it's called LuMind IDSC. That just happened in the last couple of weeks. But LuMind is an organization that, again, organizes and helps fund research for people with Down syndrome. And they've kind of taken a pretty dramatic change in the last year or so. Their new director actually has a child with Down syndrome, which I think is really sort of excited the group. They've hired some very interesting people. In the past, they had a different name, and I can't remember what it was, but in the past, a lot of their focus was around improving cognition in younger people. Their focus, I don't think they put that on completely out of their, ultimately what they want to look at, but their big goal now has become Alzheimer's disease, looking at that. And so there's now a study called LIFE-DSR that has been started. It stands for Longitudinal Investigation for Enhancing Down Syndrome Research. Ultimately, it's going to be part of the Down Syndrome Clinical Trials Network is what they're calling it. And we were fortunate. We got invited to be one of the participants in this. And we actually were also excited that we were one of the 4 funded sites. And if you look, I don't know how well you can see that, all of the other sites are academic sites. They're all university related. And then us, which is a clinical site. The reason, I think there's 2 reasons we're invited. We do some research, but I think the real reason is we have more experience taking care of people with Down syndrome than any of those folks, and we also have the volume. So 11 sites, and we're being asked to do about 20% of the people that are going to be participating in this study. So there's real opportunity for us to do this. So the first part is really a data collection. There's no intervention, no drug being used at this point, but it's going to be data collection. So it's going to be it's a 3-year study, but each person would come over a course of 2 years. So they would have 3 visits, and it'll be a blood draw, a physical exam and a history, and then a neuropsych testing, where you'd meet with a neuropsychologist, and they would do sort of the IQ testing and those kinds of tests and questions. And so that information is going to be gathered, and so we're going to learn a lot from that. But also, I think the thing we're going to learn of is how can these 11 sites work together to make this happen, and then ultimately the next step is going to be then clinical trials, with medications, immunizations, whatever the case may be, to ultimately be looking to both prevent and potentially treat Alzheimer's disease. The upside to this, one of the upsides to this, is that it's really going to help a lot of people with Down syndrome. The other upside of this is that obviously you don't have to read too much in the newspaper, but Alzheimer's disease is, and you probably a lot have been affected by it, Alzheimer's disease is very common in the rest of the population as well. So there's a lot of interest in this. It's a very expensive condition. So, it's not something you get today and you die tomorrow. It's something you get and you live potentially a long time. It costs a lot of money. So there's a lot of interest in spending some money on this to try to figure this out. Fortunately, I think people with Down syndrome are going to be a real benefit of this also being part of everyone else's condition, because there are some people that think major breakthroughs for Alzheimer's disease are going to come through Down syndrome. And so there's beginning to be some real interest in looking at this with treating people with Down syndrome. So, you know, sometimes it makes me a little frustrated. How come it took, how come we had to wait till we picked something that affected everyone else? You know what? I'm beyond that. I don't care what the reason is. You can be as selfish or we want to have the reason, but as long as people with Down syndrome are going to get benefit, it's well worth the opportunity. And I think that's where we are, and I think LumMind is really taking the lead on this. So there are already two pharmaceutical companies involved. They've given $1 million each. And there's a lot of other fundraising that LumMind is doing. So I think that this is going to be something that's very interesting. And I'm going to be unashamedly encourage you to participate in this one. I mean, it starts, it's 25 and above, so it's going to eliminate some of you because of the age thing. But I think that this is going to be a real opportunity to look at, to get some data together so that when we go to the clinical trials with drugs, that we are ready to hit the ground running. And one of the challenges in fact, I had a challenge recently by someone who was getting disability, one of our patients, because they had Alzheimer's disease, and the neurologist that works for the insurance company said, "Well, how are you making this diagnosis?" And the problem is, there aren't definitive ways to make the diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease of people with Down syndrome. There's no blood tests. The neuropsych tests that are done on the rest of us don't work well in people with Down syndrome. The neuropsych tests that are done on people with intellectual disabilities are iffy. In fact, part of this study, and they're still working it out, there's a guy in the UK that's actually developing a new test that may actually be part of this trial before it's all over. So there's some very interesting things. So, how you make the diagnosis is one of the challenges. And I think part of the real interesting thing with this will be, ultimately, it'll really be golden if the blood tests were to collect, if there ends up being a blood test that really says sort of yay or nay. And that's going to be the exciting part, because then if you can do whatever the intervention is and prevent that from rising or decrease whatever the abnormality is, or you can, if the person has it's already starting to rise, and if you can treat and see that goes down, and then that correlates with improved cognition or lack of advancement of the decline in cognition, then I think we've really shown something. I don't know if you saw. And I had to go online and listen to somebody pronounce this, and I'm still not sure I'm pronouncing it. Aducanumab, which was a drug that was just recently, they stopped the trial for Alzheimer's disease in people without Down syndrome because they found it wasn't working. So there's been a lot of lack of success with treating Alzheimer's disease or preventing it at this point. But I'm an Edison guy. It only takes one. There's 1,000. It wasn't the 1,000 fails; it was the one success, and I think that's I think that's really what we're shooting for, and I think we really have an opportunity to participate in that, and you all have an opportunity to participate in it as well. So, and I would encourage you to do that. So, what can you do? First off, we're going to continue to be sharing information on our Facebook page, as we talked about today, our web page. Go to Global Down Syndrome Foundation out of Denver has a good page on ongoing studies. They do a lot of research. The National Down Syndrome Society webpage has a lot of information on research going on. So you really want to be aware of the studies. And then this is LumMind's webpage. They have a lot of good information on studies going on as well. And then again, shortly we will have our upgraded webpage coming out. But in the meantime, if you go to the first page on our webpage, that little sign up, click on that and sign up for our newsletter, and we'll be sending information out. So I think you're really going to want to participate. I'm hoping you want to participate, because I think there's huge opportunity here. I think this is really fascinating, an opportunity. When we meet, again, those 10 other sites are they do some clinical work, but they're very research oriented. I've seen this, what this means day in and day out, and that's part of we really want to participate in this. I think there's some, we don't want to see this continue. We want to see if we can't make this stop. So again, go to clinicaltrials.gov. Again, it's a very interesting page. There's a nice search engine. You can just type in Down syndrome and you can see all sorts of things. Actually saw the 10-minute warning here. Apparently I looked past it 3 times the first time. And what will move research forward? Got to participate. I think we can people could set up the studies, but if families and people with Down syndrome don't participate, we're not going to get answers. And then certainly, if you're less than 25, come and do our hand washing thing. And as we get the other one going, certainly welcome to the hand washing if you're more than 25. But if you're less than 25, you can't do the other. Please do this one, the video study. But certainly anybody can do that. But certainly as we go forward with the other study, I think I would really encourage you to get involved because I think that's a huge issue, and certainly philanthropy plays a huge role in all these efforts. I think you met Allie, who's from our foundation, who helps us with those issues. So I'm going to stop, and I know that's a whirlwind tour of what's going on, and there's actually more, but I had to kind of cut it off somewhere. And I just think there's a lot of very interesting things going on and across the country, and again. We're not the only game in town, and we're going to try to make sure we're sharing what everyone else is doing as well, so that you can see, all the different things that are happening.
Can you speak a little more about regression?
Yeah.
What that means and what that looks like?
So regression is. So we know, unfortunately, that kids with Down syndrome are more prone to develop autism, and we know that adults are more prone to develop Alzheimer's disease. But then there's this thing in the middle that's not well defined. And so a number of us from the Down Syndrome Medical Interest Group have been looking at this and trying to give sort of, really this dates back 25 years ago when the Down Syndrome Medical Interest Group was a handful of us. And we'd sit around the table at the annual meeting and say, I saw one case of this, and we'd talk about it, didn't know what it was. And so over the course of years, it became clear that there were more, not huge numbers, but there were more of these situations arising. And so we began to try to more formalize this and sort of kind of, give a definition. So there isn't a formal definition yet at this point, unfortunately, because it doesn't even really have a formal name, and it goes by about 6 different names. But what we're calling it is the adult regression syndrome. And some people have called it late onset autism, which really by definition doesn't fit, because autism by definition is a childhood condition. But there are certainly features of it that look like autism. So someone looks like they might be developing autism at age 20, which again doesn't fit the definition. But so that's there can be loss of cognitive skills, loss of speech, behavioral changes, and other things associated with it. And it fairly rapid onset for many individuals. And we're learning more about the potential treatments, and there's a variety. So, in some ways, I consider the brain of people with Down syndrome sort of as a fragile brain. And what I mean by that is, if I get a skin infection, it's not as likely to affect my brain as it is in someone with Down syndrome. So if they get a bad infection, their cognition is more likely to be temporarily impaired while that's being treated, where you and I, that's probably less likely to be the case. Sort of like an older person who gets pneumonia, who seems much more confused than they did, and then they treat the pneumonia and they get less confused. So I think that's, to some degree, is true for people with Down syndrome. So people with Down syndrome can have a regression for lots of reasons. So many of these are very reversible. So it depends on whether you look at this. There's a subset that has this sort of more severe situation. So some of it depends on if you're looking at the broad view or you're only talking about those individuals that have the more severe version of this. And so again, that hasn't even really been decided yet but in our sense, we look to see if someone has lost skills, we go looking for all sorts of things. It may be the thyroid, it may be sleep apnea, it may be depression, it could be a new onset of diabetes, a very lengthy list. So you want to go through and sort through all those things. And then if you treat all those or address all those, and then there's a specific pattern of some of these folks that have more severe situation, then we would treat that in a different fashion. So I would encourage, I'm not going to do it justice in 3 minutes, but I would encourage you, if you want to learn more about it, to go to the LuMind website, and I think that's on our Facebook page. And again, as we're kind of preparing to upgrade our resources page, we've not been as aggressive about being able to put stuff up on the old one, because we're about the shift. So I'm not sure it's on ours, but if you go to LuMind's webpage, you can find Dr. Capone and I did a webinar on this a few months ago. I encourage you to take a look at it. You're welcome.
Is there any like behavioral therapy, like SBT, music therapy, art therapy that you would suggest for adults with Down syndrome that have also Alzheimer's?
Yeah, great question. With regards to, the data probably isn't out there, but I can tell you clinically there's definitely benefit. So, music therapy, all those therapies, I would encourage participation in those just like you would anyone else, and use those therapies at this point. Yeah. In fact, there's a nice, I forget the name of the organization, actually recommends taking, and they have some data in the non-Down syndrome population. They recommend going back, and you have to know the person personally, what their music likes were. There's data in the non-Down syndrome population. If you put like on an iPad or something, or iPod or whatever those are, I'm dating myself. Yeah, one of those. But you want to make a list that's specific for that individual. And listening to music they liked in the past actually seems to have real benefit. And this has been shown in the non-Down syndrome population. So just more relaxed, less cognitive, less mood changes and things like that. So it really has been, there's been some data that suggests that it's a positive thing in the non-Down syndrome population. And at this point, I can't imagine, I say, I've yet to meet a person with Down syndrome. I'm sure there's out there, but I've yet to meet the person with Down syndrome who doesn't like to dance. So I'm sure he's out there somewhere, but I just haven't met him yet. I've only met 10,000. So, well, great question, and I want to make it real clear. The question was, is it classical music? No, it's what the person likes. So it could be acid rock. I can't imagine, but it could be. But if that's what the person used to like, that's what you use. So forcing them to listen to something you think they're going to like is not the way to do it. Yeah. That's a great question. I don't know that we have that answer yet. The question was, do we see it more in boys or girls? And I don't think we have that answer yet. Well, I'm going to go back. I think in some cases around puberty, maybe a little more in girls. But again, that's just sort of a surmise at this point. I don't think that's a clear.
I have a question for regression. How does that correlate with Alzheimer's?
Yeah.
And have there been studies where adults that have regressed are more likely to get Alzheimer's? How does that?
Yeah, great question. What's the link between Alzheimer's and regression? We don't know. So our sense is, at least in our chapter, where we are right now, is that they are unrelated. But I'm not 100% sure. There is no data to tell us that for sure. And the question would be, it's not been around long. Well, it actually was first described in the 40s by somebody that worked in a residential facility or an institution, probably at that point. But really, as far as a general discussion, it really is really just in the last few years. So there really isn't a crowd, if you will, a cohort that we've been able to follow for a long enough time to know about what their results with Alzheimer's disease are. Now, we do know that, unfortunately, some people with Down syndrome have plaques and tangles as early as the 20s. So could it be possible that there's a relationship? I would say that it's not out of the realm of possibility, but our sense now is that they're two separate entities. Because the way that it presents is different. Alzheimer's disease, unfortunately, in 2019 only goes one direction, unfortunately. It is it may go up and down a little bit, but ultimately it's a steady loss of skills. Where a lot of people with regression will pretty rapidly drop off and then will stay the same for years. Some will decline and some will get better, but some will just stay the same for years. So it does seem to be a different entity than Alzheimer's disease, as best as we can tell. But again, more over time.
Talking about cancer, in breast cancer and the Downs, how
Yeah. So, questions about how high or low percentage of breast cancer? We don't know, but it seems to be pretty uncommon. So, in ours, the little study we did, we really had no cases of aggressive breast cancer, and in the study that we did with the computer study, you really had to do about 17,000 mammograms to find a case. So it's a pretty low incidence. But again, I think hang on to that one because we're more to come. But I think my sense would be we really need to sit down and make this part of the clinical guidelines before we go too far off to say that we should or shouldn't we do them. But I think we want to begin to really look at this again because I think we want to do things that make sense.
Are there data banks that are being kept on all these diagnoses?
Yeah.
And is it national or is it global?
So the question is, are there data banks? And so certainly as part of the Life DSR thing, that's going to be part of what we're doing, gathering clinical data. The federal government, the NIH, has a database that they're keeping, and I'm drawing a blank on the name of it. Someone remember? I've drawn a blank. But anyway, so they have one. At this point, it's primarily, I sort of, not too harsh, but it's sort of a phone book. And by that I mean it's family entered data, primarily so that researchers can contact families to participate in research studies. And there is some family entered clinical data. But as far as any sort of download from electronic medical records or anything like that, there is not at this point. Ultimately, that federal government one, they want to get more clinical data, and ultimately they would like to get blood and tissue samples, but it's not there, not at this point.
Comment about cancer with Down syndrome. If you were to list the top 3 reasons that Down syndrome people die, what would be the top 3?
It depends on your age. So in a little study we did, went back and looked at the folks in our practice that had passed away. And the younger folks, it was still congenital heart disease that was the more common. But we went back to the very beginning, and so that's going to be less and less as time goes on for adults because, we saw a lot of adults early on in the clinic that were born before the mid-'70s, early '80s when the ability to treat congenital heart disease became a possibility. So before that, like when my Uncle Leo was born, great Uncle Leo, if he had congenital heart disease, there was nothing they could have done. And so we saw a lot of adults early on that had gotten into their mid-30s who their congenital heart disease unfortunately caught up with them. So we should see less and less, at least in our practice earlier on, congenital heart disease in the younger folks. In the older folks, unfortunately, it's Alzheimer's disease, it's pneumonia, which is often associated with Alzheimer's disease, would really be the sort of the two biggies, unfortunately.
This is John, a question on national. Do you know anything about this large grant or gift that's going to MIT and research?
It's a great question, but I'd sort of like some of it. I don't know. That's interesting. All I've read so far is what you've probably read in the paper, and so MIT got a huge. And I've never heard MIT's name connected with Down syndrome ever, until I read it in the paper a couple weeks ago. So I don't really know what they're doing. But with $40 million or whatever they got, you hope they're going to do something.
There's a documentary called Alive Inside, and that's the one that's shows what cancer therapy.
Yeah. So the comment was, there's a video called Alive, or a documentary called Alive Inside. I'm going to actually, I think people are interested in what you're saying here. Can you pass that down? So if you could just repeat what you said first.
Alive Inside is the name of the documentary.
Okay.
It was just elderly people with Alzheimer's, and it just showed what a powerful. It was exactly that. They made playlists of their favorite songs and how it completely changed their personality and kind of temporarily, you know, how they, and functioning and cognitively. and
I think while we're waiting for the big breakthrough, we got to do whatever we can in the
Yeah.
meantime to make life better.
But my question was about, and it might be too big a topic, so you can say, like, I can't do this now. Birth control. How, I mean, we've had some kind of fits and starts, and now, you know, we're not doing anything, which I think is, I don't know if that's a rational option long term. And anyway, I'd like to hear
So a question about birth
is
control.
going on at the
Yeah, so I'm not aware of any studies going on. A couple issues. One is, you know, I think this is going to become a bigger issue going forward. I mean, I think opportunity is going to become more of a, I say that, you know, one of the advantages of inclusion is that people with Down syndrome get to see what the other kids without Down syndrome are doing. One of the disadvantages of inclusion is that kids with Down syndrome get to see what the other kids with Down syndrome are doing, or don't have Down syndrome. So I think we're going to see more going forward. So I think that it's going to be an issue, be more of an issue. I do know that people with Down syndrome tend to have more abnormal blood clotting issues, and so there are a little more concerns with using birth control pills in women with Down syndrome. So that's an issue. I think most of the birth control methods that have to be used at the moment probably are not going to be reliable for most of our patients. And so, you know, things like the pill or implants or things, I think, but there's not a lot of information on that, unfortunately. It's interesting, we don't have a lot, to the best of our knowledge, sexually active patients in our practice. I suspect that's not going to be the same. When I retire, I suspect it's going to be different than it is today.
Going in and have an opinion about the
Memantine, yeah. Yeah, I don't know. You know, it's interesting. The question is about opinion about memantine. I think certainly in folks with Down syndrome and Alzheimer's disease, it has not been shown to be beneficial. There was one study out of the UK that suggested that medications for Alzheimer's disease actually improved life expectancy of people with Down syndrome. But if you went back and looked at the study, it improved the life expectancy by 3 years. But the group that took the drug were 3 years younger than the group that didn't take the drug. So I think that's, in fact, Dr. Smith from Milwaukee and I had a letter to the editor published sort of saying, you know, that really probably wasn't doing justice to the topic. But there's a group called Cochrane, and they take a lot of studies together, and they've looked at memantine in the studies that are available, and it's not helpful for people with Down syndrome that have Alzheimer's disease. So will it be helpful in the younger folks? I think we got to do this study to find out. One of the things that's interesting about memantine is it may have some prevention of neurotoxicity. So, I mean, just life causes our bodies and our brains to be affected from a toxic standpoint. And there is some suggestion that memantine may actually help prevent some of that. So, unfortunately, you know, if you're treating somebody who's 40 or 50 or 60 with Alzheimer's disease, that's been going on for decades. And there's so much damage, unfortunately, that's already been done. It's not surprising that medication doesn't help. Would it help somebody who's taking it when they're 15 or 20? I think that's a good question. I don't think we have an answer to that, unfortunately. I can stand here all day, but I know if you have your son or daughter to pick up, you may want to do that. And I know there's treats outside. I'm happy to stay, but I don't want to keep you if you got to go.